I'm always on the camera.
All right, hello. Grades. I assume the grades got posted, right? I did everything. Okay, good. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the grading process and go over a couple of things and maybe answer questions, if any, about the midterm. First thing is I do a fairly complicated matrix to make it as fair as possible. And I go through after I do the raw grading to see if there are questions that were missed by half or more of the class. Because I take the position that if half of you have gotten an answer wrong, something's wrong with the question. Therefore, what I do is I do not deduct anything for those questions that were, and there were 4 of them, that more than half got wrong. So I don't take anything off for that. However, I then went back and I looked and I said, well, wait a minute. What about the people that got these right? I mean, no one got 100%, no one got all the questions right at all. The best scores were a couple people got 5 wrong. So when you subtract the 4, that would be 1 wrong. So then I went back and I added back credit to anybody that got one of those questions right. Because I figured if you got the right answer, you're entitled to credit for it. So that's why a couple of you might have gotten more than 100% on the score, and it's only because of the way the math worked out. There were a number of points per question, and I just added it up, and that's how I did the math. So I tried to be as fair as possible to make up for grades that were not good, and add them back in, and so on. Okay? I want to tell you what those questions, those bad questions were, why they were wrong, or why I ignored them. Bless you. And there may have been a couple of them that I didn't even mark off for anybody, just because when I looked at them, I said, well, okay, they could all be right. Or, again, just trying to be as fair as possible. Everybody understand what I just said?
We appreciate you.
I'm trying. Okay. So, the first one that I disqualified, I probably, in talking about it, didn't discuss in any great detail the concept of reverters and conditions, which is kind of a technical thing. When I went back and looked at the question, it was very technical and maybe, like I said before, belongs in another building. And that was the one that said that the person owned real estate conveyed to her by her father with the restriction to her unless the property is used for commercial purposes. And that is a condition. And if the condition fails, then the title fails and the property goes back to the grantor. That is, I probably didn't get into that in any great detail, so I disqualified it. So it's called a reverter. And what literally happens is if the condition fails, the title will revert back to the grantor. And that is what happened. She used it for commercial purposes and the title went back to her father.
And the father didn't have to do anything?
Correct.
Okay.
Oh yeah, because there was an answer that said the father had to.
The father had to do some quiet title action to get it back.
Right, but that's not what a quiet title action is about. That's part of today's finishing up from what got left over from last week on the litigation. We'll talk about a quiet title action. The other one, and I was a little surprised that this got disqualified, was the definition of a fee simple interest in land. And a fee simple interest in land, the correct answer was complete ownership in land lasting until the end of time, which means that you can, it's yours 100%. The whole bundle of sticks belongs to whoever owns fee simple. It's the broadest type of unrestricted ownership, which means you can pass it along to anybody you want, to your own heirs. You can give it to a charity. You can give it to your best friend. You can do anything you want with it, either during your lifetime or by will.
I think until the end of time threw things off, because I don't think you mentioned like time part of it. You mentioned, yeah, the whole thing is sticks and everything is yours.
Yeah.
You never mentioned anything about time.
Okay, but
it's no limit.
Oh, you
there was no limit. So probably the choice that was picked by a few people was complete ownership of land until death. And that was a life estate. That was something we talked about separately. Also, I will tell you, not 100%, But for most of you, if you went back and changed your answer, you should not have done that. I also found in a couple of situations that when you turned the page and went to the next questions, it might have answered the question before. So if you had looked at something and seen that answer, and people who got the one incorrect, on the next page got it correct and didn't think to go back and say, wait a minute, those are interrelated. And that wasn't deliberate, by the way. So, let's just see. Oh, okay. This is one I just gave up, because there really was a correct answer out of the 4, but any of the answers were correct. And I want to try, because there were a couple of questions that dealt with the same issue, and in some places people had no problem with it, in other places it was confusing. And that is, what kind of deed transfers title? Any kind of deed transfers title. So the answer to which of these deeds will convey good title to a purchaser, the correct answer was all of the above, or any of the above. So I get credit for all of the answers because they're all correct. But that was the real answer, was any of the above. And I don't know in taking tests whether you start to get a feeling to look away from that as an answer and think it's a red herring, all of the above or any of the above, but in this case it was not. Another disqualified question was the subject to clause in the deed. And what's always subject to clause in the deed. And I know I brushed on it in the contract and went through it, but the one that is always there is real estate taxes, because that never goes away. The others were reservations of record. Well, you don't want reservations because that prevents you from doing something. You don't want conditions, because a condition is like where the person used it for commercial purposes and lost title. And you certainly don't want mortgages unless you're assuming one. Another one that tripped people up a little bit, but wasn't one of my disqualified questions, and yet if you looked a little further down, you would have gotten the answer from another question, and that is something that is not a requirement for the deed to have legal significance. Of
the grantee?
Correct. The person receiving the deed, the grantee does not have to sign it. And so that theme was in a couple of different questions.
Is that the one that zoning was one of the answers?
No.
Yep, I picked something.
Okay.
Well, apparently it was a different question. I think
Yeah,
zoning.
I picked something
Yeah.
too.
Okay. No, zoning was, wait a minute, I'll tell you where zoning was. I'll find it.
Is that one of the marijuana?
Zoning may have been one that is not,
Yeah, which one is not a?
Yeah, which is not part of.
and then I'll ask you, I'll ask a question also, because in the question writing training that I had to sit through, they try and tell you to stay away from red herrings and watch the phraseology. Do you find that the not is a problem? Do you find that to be a confusing thing to say which is not one of them? Where there's only one that's, okay. I want to improve it as best I can. I got to come up with another test,
That's fair.
And I want it to be a good one. For you, not for me. I know the answers I'm writing.
I hope so.
I hope so too. Don't see the zoning. I know there was something in here with zoning, but I don't remember.
Well, I thought it was like what is not part of the deed or what's not required of the deed or something.
It was the grantee's signature, but oh, there it is. Which of the following is not a necessary part of a deed?
Yeah.
The names of the grantor and grantee, that's necessary. 2 witnesses, that's necessary. Legal description, that's necessary. Zoning, not so much.
Oh, so we got it right.
Yeah.
Awesome.
That was not a question.
Yeah.
No, that's not a question. That's a approval.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
We got it all.
Just checking. That.
What does the, go ahead.
Go ahead, next question.
Well, it was the one about the cannabis and what the landlord, like, would have to pay extra for.
That's exactly, that was the next invalid question.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so the concept there is, it's not what, it's in negotiating who should pay for what. In turn, and what you have to be thinking about is, by the way, it's not a hard and fast rule. It's the way leases are negotiated with tenant improvements and such. So you have two types of tenant improvements to a property typically. One that improves the property generally, and the property can be used for anything. The other is an improvement that is specific for the tenant's use. So, where you have the cannabis facility, not retail, but say an extraction or grow house or something. So what should the landlord pay for that is not necessarily just for the tenant?
Electricity.
Yeah, electricity.
Wrong.
What? Not security.
Also, not security is correct.
Okay. If it was
Both of those things,
I think
because remember,
bathrooms.
it wasn't
Those are
just
bathrooms,
it wasn't just electricity. My answer is triple electric capacity.
Oh.
Okay, so you go into a normal warehouse, and you might have what's 400 amp power for electricity, and that'll operate most machines and most equipment and such. For where you have light growing plants, or you have heavy stuff extracting chemicals, they need 1200 amps. At least that's what I've heard in a couple of situations. So, but that's specialized for the use.
Bathroom.
All right? The answer is accessible bathrooms.
Oh.
Because
That's special.
every it's not special. It's not special. The accessible bathrooms are something that every building needs if it's open to the public.
You like that?
Well, it depends on
Just
the
like
size.
No.
No.
So just the,
If you are what's called a place of public accommodation, where you are open to the public and you are having people come into your facility, then you have to have ADA bathrooms and 36-inch doors and ramps and parking and all those things. And all of those things can be used in a landlord's property, whether it's being used as an Amazon warehouse, a cannabis warehouse, or a movie theater.
I work right. Is that, dude, like, people who rent in malls, like, they don't have to follow that? Because
Why not?
there's stores where, like, no, you can't use that bathroom.
That means that the bathroom is not a place of public
Oh,
accommodation.
because it's for employees.
However, I'm going to tell you something interesting. It may be a store policy that bathroom is only for employees, and it's not a public bathroom. And the reason for that is, in the shopping center, the mall you're talking about, go across the hall and go down 3 stores, and there's a public restroom that the mall has designated for customers. The bathroom, and every store has one, is there for employees, and is part of the required build-out. But I'd be willing to bet if you go into it, unless it's a very old facility, it is going to be ADA compliant, because it has to be.
For employees.
Even for the employees, exactly. Now, you can go into some older places. I mean, there's a restaurant we used to go to, and I don't know how they got away with it, or maybe we just never got inspected, but the hallway to the bathroom, they had extra chairs stacked up there. You'd have to do this to get in. I mean, you know, and there's some restaurants that will have the designated accessible restroom, and then the other restrooms, because they had extras, and they only had to retrofit one of them. The doors have to be wider, they have to have the bars. You know, there's a whole bunch of things you have to do. Right down to the type of door handles. I mean, I don't know if you think about this, but when you look at a lever door handle, compared, look at that, I pointed the door open. Welcome, thank you, that was right on time.
How's the door handle?
If you go to an older place, what do you see?
A knob.
A knob. Well, if someone has a weakness in their hand, for whatever reason, due to a disability, you can't do this. You can't grab in turn, but you could do this. Also, dogs can do this. You gotta watch out for that too.
Professor, but that also, I think there is a term that they use that it has to be economically feasible.
No.
If you have to change your
No.
structure.
I'll tell you where the economics comes in. The economics only comes in where if you're going to renovate 50% or more of the value of the property, then you have to bring it up to code. That's what most of the laws are. So, okay, and because they're not gonna come along if you're just doing business and you've been doing business in the same place for 30 years, unless there's a real problem, they're not gonna come in and say, okay, you have to spend $25,000 and redo your whole place. Now that may come from other sources besides the government. For example, if it's a franchise restaurant, or a hotel, or even a car dealership, requirements for renovation come from the franchisor. And that's altogether different. And that can be very, very expensive. And it's why when you go to those kinds of places, it's a pleasant environment. Because you know when you go to a Marriott, you know you're going to go in there and you're going to find the furniture is going to be nice looking. The TVs, they may not be this year's TV, but they're not going to be a tube. It's going to be some kind of a flat screen that may be this thick instead of this thick, but eventually they're going to be this thick. I just had a client who bought a hotel, and I mean, within the next year he has to spend a couple of $100,000 changing all the door locks. Not for the ADA, but because the hotel, the franchisor said, you have to switch the locks out because everybody wants keyless, where you can open it on your phone. And that's not that it's required by law, it's required because the Marriott wants to stay competitive. Because if Hilton's going to do it at the same level, whether it's garden in a courtyard, however they prepare them, they got to stay that way. So I think that's, it's more, to me it's more trouble to unlock the phone, open the app, find your thing, and do it than to take the key out of your wallet or your pocket.
It's the most annoying thing ever.
Any other questions about the exam? Rating, questions? No? Okay. Let me make that go away.
I needed that key, but
This thing is just...
and that's how people steal.
I've never
from.
seen that other guy
People steal, well not steal, but like, it's easier to do like,
to break in.
like for me to check my cousin, see, I'm not really confused, stuff like that. It's down.
Are there any questions, specific questions you want me to ask on this next exam? No?
The doorknob question.
What time does class start? What time does class start?
That, you all failed that. I can tell you that. If I was grading for that, you all failed that one.
I wouldn't say all.
Right. Well, that's why I gave the first 5 answers the week before the exam, because nobody was in here. I want to try. Is it helpful to have the outline on the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Give me a moment to find the machine. I'm going to talk while I'm clicking. But so when we ran out of steam last week, we were talking about real estate litigation, and I think we left off on evictions, and I told you that evictions were limited to where you have a landlord-tenant relationship. But that's not always the case, because there are situations where someone is in possession of property, either exclusive possession or joint possession with someone else, and the person who owns the property or has maybe the leasehold interest in the property doesn't want them there anymore. Examples. We talked a little bit last time about early occupancy agreements in connection with a purchase, or delayed occupancy agreements in connection with the purchase. That is not a landlord-tenant relationship. Any of you have a roommate that is not a family member, or where you live? Or we passed that at this level. Did you in college maybe have roommates?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Did you ever have a roommate you didn't like?
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever have a roommate that wasn't on the lease, but you made some kind of a side agreement?
I had like a roommate whose boyfriend basically lives.
Ah, perfect. That was the next topic. Was okay. All right. So that kind of a situation.
That's annoying.
The boyfriend has moved in. You're not happy. Okay. Or worse yet, the expression is when love flies out the window. Now the person who does have the lease, and it doesn't have to be your roommate. It could be you could have a significant other living with you, and you have a fight. Things go bad. And you want them to leave. And they don't. And they're not on the lease, and you don't have a sublease with them. They're just there. They're there by permission. Why? Because you said, sure, move in. Well, you control the property. Either you own the apartment or house, or you're the tenant. So what do? Well, I mean, as formal as this sounds, and unfortunately, whenever you're dealing legal, and you need to get legal with something like this, even if it's, what would normally be an informal relationship, you really have to go to the step of being more formal for two reasons. One, you have to give notice of things, and you may have to prove that you gave notice. So you would just hand the person a letter saying that, you have 5 days, 7 days, whatever it is, to move out. Get out. You're no longer allowed to live here. And if they don't, then you go to court, and you can go to the judge and say, Judge, this person does not have any legal right to live here. I have asked them to leave. They're refusing to leave, but they're not a tenant, and therefore you have them rejected. Okay? That's a significant other I jumped. We talked about the contract purchaser briefly. That's where someone has a right because they were given early occupancy, and then they don't close. So now they're not leasing it, they don't own it, their time to close is over, but they're living in the house. That's a problem. Same thing, you have to reject them. The way to an ejectment proceeding is a little more complicated and less common than an eviction. Eviction is easy, it's statutory, the county court judges all know how to deal with it. You could even go to the clerk's office and get forms and do your own evictions. It's designed to be very simple. Ejectment is not quite like that. Estates. We've had situations, and this is all real. Some of it's theoretical, but a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about right now is 100% real and it happens all the time. So, somebody passes away. In this case, I'm going to say, I don't remember the particular one I'm thinking about. Father passed away. And there may have been half-siblings involved, I don't recall specifically, but there were there was the mother, there was a trust, there was the good siblings, and the one bad sibling. All the time. And she was in the house. And they wanted to sell the house, and she wouldn't get out. Now, this person inherited a 1/3 interest in the house, maybe, maybe not. Maybe it was in a trust and she was a beneficiary. There are circumstances where you cannot do any of this. So let's say, it had to be in the trust, I don't want to be confusing about this, because if the person owns the property, it's an ownership like a 1/3 interest as a tenant in common, because dad passed away, 3 siblings inherited, and each one of you has equal rights to possession. So you can't throw them out. They're an owner. They're entitled to be in there. So that takes us to the next section, partition. Now we have the stay with the same facts. Parent passed away, 3 siblings have acquired the property, 2 siblings decide we want to sell this property and take the cash and split the cash up. Nobody's living in the house, it's empty. The 3rd sibling is difficult. I'll be diplomatic, the camera's on. The 3rd sibling is difficult, and they don't want to cooperate. Well, they had a fight with the other 2. This is just every family's got one. So this person just doesn't want to cooperate and says, no, I don't care. I don't want to sell the house. I like having this house. But nobody's living in the house. So we're not renting it. I don't care. I want to sell the house. Okay, so a partition action is an involuntary action to divide property up. Well, originally it was designed for the situation, as many things in our agricultural-based society, where you had the family farm, and the family farm consisted of 30 acres. And I picked that because I have 3 siblings in this example. So you'd go to court, and you'd say to the judge, Judge, we own this 30 acres together, bless you. There's 3 of us, and we're arguing, and we can't decide whether or not to sell the property or to what to do, and we can't agree. And the judge will say, oh, okay, that's real easy. You have 3 of you, 30 acres. Each one of you has 10 acres. Divide here, go away. That's called a partition. Real easy, it's like cutting a cake. Except, it's not so easy where the road maybe only serves one portion of it. It's not so easy where the easy division leaves one person with lakefront property, the other 2 not. Or any other kind of physical attributes. Maybe there's a house on a portion of it. There's all kinds, and there's ways to do that. But when it's a house or a condominium unit, you can't slice it like a cake. First of all, or it could also be a piece of property that's not able to be divided because zoning says you can't divide, you can't subdivide it any further. You have to have a 1-acre lot in this subdivision, and it's 1 acre, and you're not allowed to chop it up. So what happens is the court orders a sale, forced sale, and it's literally just like a mortgage foreclosure, except different location, different court order. Property gets sold at public auction, and any of the 3 have the right to bid, or the public can bid. And just as I mentioned with the foreclosure action, any of them get credit because they already own 1/3. So if the property is worth $90,000, any one of them can bid and they automatically get credit for 30. Because it's a 1/3, so they already own a 1/3. So that's how that works. If it gets sold to a third party, money gets divided up, split amongst the owners. It can get sold for more, it can get sold for less. Typically what would happen is if there's no bidding, one of the 3 would bid for it, or the 2 are going to bid against each other, or the 3 are going to bid against each other, until somebody decides they don't want to go any higher, and it'll go to the highest bidder, and the other 2 will split the money. And that's how partition works.
So the forced sale is a public auction?
Yes. It's a forced sale because it's ordered by the court. That's what a forced sale is.
Because they could have decided to sell it on their own.
Then we wouldn't be in court.
Right.
They can absolutely, you can always agree. See, that's the solution to every dispute. You can always agree. I'm in the middle right now of mediating between 2 business partners who are both my clients in a project I've been representing them both in, and they're not agreeing on how to move forward. And unlike a lot of my agreements, we don't have this agreement because of the way they own the property. They don't have a buy-sell agreement. The buy-sell agreement that eliminates this, and I believe I talked about this in deadlocks and disputes, but the buy-sell agreement that creates the agreement when you're not agreeing is that it's a contract, you provide for a contract. The contract has all the essential terms, including the price. The only thing that's missing is the buyer and the seller. And so whoever comes forward with this piece of paper has set the price. He presents it to his partner and says, I'm willing to buy you out for $1 million. And the person receiving the piece of paper has 2 choices. He can say yes and sell, or he turns around and buys the other guy for $1 million. And the reason that works so well is the person coming forward with the piece of paper sets the price that he's willing to pay and that he's willing to receive. And that works. That's how you can kind of like force an agreement. Okay, we touched, the quiet title action came up briefly a little while ago in talking about, yes, question?
Well, the credit bidding, what was that? What you just
Okay,
went through?
credit bidding. 3 of you, let's say it's you and 2 siblings, okay, and you own a $90,000 piece of property. You own how much of that property?
A third.
A third. What's a third of $90,000?
30.
Come on, come on. You did that this
30,000.
morning.
$30,000.
Okay. So, do you have to pay yourself?
No.
So if you bid $100,000, then the 1/3 of that you don't have to pay. It's you don't pay yourself. That's the credit bid. You get credit for the fact that you own the third.
No.
Okay?
I don't, why would anyone do that?
What?
So you're saying they own this property?
Three siblings own, but I'm saying siblings, it could be business partners, it could be anything.
But they can't agree,
Right.
so they're gonna,
So they're going to put it up
Try
for
to
public
buy?
auction? No, they're going to put it up for public auction. They can't agree. So let's say you have 3 people that can't agree. 2 of them want to sell the property, 1 of them doesn't. But that 1 doesn't want to agree on a price with the other 2 to buy them out. So you say, okay, we're going to put it up for public auction. And it goes up for public auction, and let's say, in our example, the $90,000 example, you get a bid from a third party for $50,000. Well, that's not enough. So the one of the 3 says, I think it's worth 90, and I'm willing to pay 90, and I'm going to bid 90. You with me so far? So it sells for 90. The person that bid doesn't have to pay, but they don't have to pay themselves. They only have to pay the other 2, 30 and 30.
oh,
Okay, clear? Okay. Okay, quieting title. It really is exactly what it says. There's noise on your title, if you will. There's something wrong. There's a problem with the title. What kind of a problem? Well, I have a bunch of examples. Clouds. A cloud on title is any defect that causes a question regarding the title. It could be, I've got a few examples on there. It could be a mistake in the legal description. It could be a simple mistake that in a meets and bounds description, they said go east instead of go west, and it just carried through, and that would cause things to go bad. They could have had a name wrong. They could have had the grantor's name as Joe and his real name was John. And so that would call into question whether there was a proper person signing the deed. And you can't go back and get it corrected because the person that signed it incorrectly and didn't catch it was typed wrong. Where is he? I want to take a guess.
Jail.
Dead? That's usually when you can't get somebody to sign. There's other ways around that, though. So, or maybe there's a wild deed. Maybe somewhere along the line, Fred the Crook signed a deed to the property because he knew if nobody was watching it, it was a record long enough, he could cause a problem. Or someone who was talking about the notice of interest? Okay, somebody files a wrong notice of interest, where it really doesn't have it, or it's improper, or something like that. So that winds up in the title.
What happens if, like, within a contract or something like that, like the attorney who's preparing it has typos and stuff? Like,
Well, that's where these things come from, believe it or not, more than anything else.
well, what if like his strategy's correct, but he like forgot the or something of that nature?
That's where you quiet the title. That's where you can go back and assuming you can't get somebody to fix it. Most of the time when that happens, you get what's called a corrective deed. And you go back to the person who signed the document, you do the deed, you get a do-over is what it is. A new deed, which you cannot do, and this is a technical nuance, but this is important if you ever have this come up in the transaction. It does not mean you take white out to the document, change it, and re-record it. That doesn't work. Re-recording does not work. It doesn't fix the mistake. So what you do is you do a new deed, and you call it corrective deed across the top, and in the body, under the legal description, you put a paragraph explaining what's going on, that it's being made to correct an error in the legal description. You put the recording information of the prior deed, so that you're actually saying what is going on. And it also prevents you from paying dock stamps again on the transfer. So you go back and you fix it. Now, in the situation where you can't get the person to sign a new deed, for whatever reason, They're dead, they're in jail, they're in Argentina, wherever it is, you can't get it done. You can go to court, and you can file an action against anybody that might have an adverse claim based upon it, and have a court say, okay, we hereby state that the deed now reads this.
So what if the,
I apologize, I left something.
Oh, there's nothing there. Okay. No problem.
I just didn't want to lose it.
No problem.
so there's a certain font or,
Those are plans to the Death Star. I could have had them. Sorry.
so there's like certain fonts, colors, text size, anything like that affect
No.
the binding?
No, the only time that would actually come into play is if in court, they actually have, I think more in federal, I don't know about state court, they have minimums.
They have what?
Minimum sizes. You can't file a pleading in 6-point type, and the main reason is everything gets scanned. And if it becomes, once upon a time they were microfilmed. Now they're scanned like everything else. So, or the thing that makes me absolutely crazy when a client tries to do, and I know they mean well, but I'm going to tell you, don't do this because it really is difficult. I can't tell you how many times I've had a client take out the phone and take a picture of the contract that they just signed and send it to me saying, here's the signed contract. It becomes impossible to work with. It's just logistically, there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, there's provisions in contracts now that specifically say that a PDF or a fax or, setting it up from 1990, a PDF or a scan or some electronic signature is as valid as what we call a lead ink signature. There is a whole electronic signature statute, but that more relates to things like DocuSign, which I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's where you actually go on through software and you verify your identity and you verify the signature that you're going to use, and you specifically agree that that's a valid signature that binds you. That's a little different. Nowadays, what we're doing is we're taking leases, contracts, whatever, and we're just PDFing them back and forth. Once they're completely signed, usually they're in color. Even if they're not, the parties have agreed that that's valid. So that's why, no, there's nothing about fonts, there's nothing about font sizes, except when you're dealing in clerk's recordings, federal courts, some state courts, and there's also standard legibility. You used to have, so legal descriptions attached to deeds are not always, remember, a deed is not always lot 3, block 4 of Happy Acres. A deed can be a detailed meets and bounds description that's 3 pages long. Well, as that gets, and people don't retype those because there's where you're inviting a problem. When you get these very, very long legal descriptions and keep retyping them, somebody's going to make a mistake, guaranteed. There's distances, there's direction, there's degree signs, minute signs, second signs. They're all going to get, something's going to get messed up. So people take the last deed and they make a picture of the last deed and they attach the legal description. Well, there's something called replicative fading. It goes on with photocopies and clones. When you get further down and you keep making copies of copies, it becomes less and less legible. When you try and record that, sometimes you can't see it. And then you get a stamp back from the clerk's office that said, illegible legal description. Whatever, it's more than that, but it's a problem. They'll take it, they'll record it, but it becomes a problem because then you don't know what the document's supposed to say. Sometimes they'll actually reject it, and they'll send it back and make you send a legible copy. So, correcting a mistake, though, when you can't get somebody to come forward to correct it, that would be done through a quiet title action. A claim of ownership, any other claim of rights.
You're ejecting someone for.
We're not ejected. This is
not
now
ejected.
quieting title. We're cleaning the title.
Oh, I thought this was going to be injected.
No. We're the next level. We're 2 down actually from ejected. See? See?
It's kind of hard to see.
Here's the glare.
Here's the,
You have it in your email
Oh, yeah.
somewhere. Okay, so clearing clouds, wild deed, wild mortgage. Could be a mortgage with a bad legal description that was supposed to be next door, and they had the wrong lot. I had one with a legal description problem where the surveyor made a mistake, and these townhouses over here that were being built, there was, apparently when surveyors do their computations, there's some kind of a check digit. There's some thing where they repeat a number. Anyway, the whole thing was 2,000 feet off. Everything was right, but it was 2,000 feet off, which means that while the townhouses were built over here, the description was over there. That was a problem. That had to be a lawsuit, because you couldn't get everybody along the line to come back and fix it. Same thing where I think I described a situation where the developer sold the lake rights to the and the description came right through my client's backyard, because that's the way that the descriptions work, and couldn't get the neighbors to sign off. Had to do a quiet title action for that. Name mistakes. So I went through name mistakes. Went through. Okay, that's all of it. Any other questions about quiet title? You'll probably be very happy to know I think that's the end of real estate litigation. Until things go bad. I want to make you look at the property with me here. Okay. Contracts. We started off the term going through the contract for purchase and sale in some significant detail. So you can see in a contract for purchase and sale, there's a lot of things that people are supposed to do. It all boils down at the end of the day to closing, where somebody pays the money and somebody conveys proper title. But there are a lot of other things in there. There's inspection rights, there's supplying information, there's quality of title, there's all kinds of representations and warranties in a contract. Otherwise we wouldn't have 8 pages of 8-point type to deal with, or 47 pages of 12-point type. Wouldn't have it. So what happens if somebody doesn't do what they're supposed to do in a contract? In the what's that?
It's not performance.
Well, we'll get there. Lack of performance, yes, that's also called a default. Yes, they failed to perform. The technical term is default, or default, depending upon which side of the aisle you're sitting on, or how you like to say it. It doesn't make any difference at all. It's when somebody doesn't do what they're supposed to do. And it could be, I mean, the biggest default that you see complained of is a failure to close. Most commercial contracts and many residential contracts have a lot of contingencies in them. And until you get past those contingencies, which are conditions to require somebody to close, maybe the buyer has a contingency to get financing. That's very common, especially in residential. Otherwise, there could be an inspection. But that was another answer that I think I gave as a freebie, where an inspection period, an investigation period, a due diligence period, all of the above is correct, but I gave it to everyone because they're all correct. So, but during that period, if you remember, during that, whatever you want to label it as, you have a free right to cancel the contract. So as long as you have those free rights, you can get out of the contract because you haven't satisfied the contingency and you get your deposit back. The deposit stands primarily to ensure the buyer's performance. What happens if you get past the contingencies? Now you're in that period which gets shorter and shorter in many contracts between the end of the contingencies and the time to close, and the buyer just doesn't show up to close. Just simply can't or won't. There may be a dispute. Well, you told them. It could be all kinds of things. They could make a claim that you said the rent roll was this, but it's really not because when we verified it's that. Yeah, but you had all this time to verify it, and you had to verify it during the inspection period. Unless it's a real bold-faced misrepresentation, the buyer's probably going to be stuck because they didn't raise the issue in time. There could be all kinds of things. You told me this property was blue when I came out to inspect it, it was green. I don't want a green property. That should have been done during the inspection. The real number one answer is there's no money. For whatever reason, the buyer can't come up with the money, they don't close. Now there is a default. So, what happens? The seller has suffered. Don't feel too bad. The seller has suffered. The seller has suffered because they've taken the property off the market. They've stopped trying to sell it for the 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 9 weeks, whatever the contract provides for. They've missed all these opportunities because this was a hot property and there was this whole array of other buyers that were in town because it was buyer season for whatever reason. It could have been a waterfront property with a 100-foot dock during the boat show. Is a perfect example. But one guy wrote the contract and then all the other yachtsmen left. And now you can't sell this property anymore because it's really expensive. And unless you have a $4 million yacht to dock there, you don't want this property on the water because it's a crappy little house with a 100-foot dock. And they don't want the house, they want the dock. And that was a unique property. So, they're damaged. The buyer is damaged. So what do they do? What's happened now? Well, what are their damages? How do you figure out how much the buyer is hurt? I'm sorry, the seller is hurt. Well, the easy answer would be the difference in value between what they could have sold it for during the boat show and what they can sell it for now. It could be that because it was a unique property and it's only really of high value to the guy from the boat show or a lot of people from the boat show, it's now worth $300,000 less. That's damages. That's the differential in value, bless you. It could be that they've spent money. They could have moved out. They could have bought another house. They could have done all these things, and they could raise all kinds of claims of why the seller is suffering from the buyer's failure to close. All damages. How do we avoid all of these subjective claims?
Put it in the contract.
But what in the contract?
Well, if you don't do this, this is gonna happen. Type of thing.
The answer is before your eyes.
Get you to do it.
Agreed, damages, agreed.
Closer? Closer?
Contract.
Getting there. The answer is before your eyes. Look up.
Specific performance.
Nope, you're on the wrong side. Come on, brokers? Nobody? All right. Enough. Liquidated damages.
Well.
I told you the answer was before your eyes. It's right there. You could have picked. You could have picked one. All right. Liquidated damages. What that means is an agreed upon dollar amount that if the buyer does not perform, the seller and buyer have agreed that that's the amount that's going to be paid to the seller for his misery. And you know where that number is always comes from in a purchase and sale agreement? The deposit. That's what it is. The deposit is the agreed upon amount, which is why when you're negotiating a contract, unless you're the buyer trying to steal and you try to buy something with no cash, the person who's not paying attention to my property with no cash. Yes, I can you. The seller is going to want a bigger deposit than a smaller deposit, especially with specialized property in my example, where it's a limited universe of buyers that want this property. They're going to want to increase the deposit. And the other problem is, staying with my example, those people are not going to have a mortgage contingency, and they're probably not going to want an inspection contingency because they don't care about the property, and they have so much money they don't care about the money. They want this house because they want the 100-foot dock, so they can bring the yacht down here and stay on it in the winter, or leave it here when they don't want it up north. So there you have a seller that's got to get a large deposit, a large amount of liquidated damages. It used to be that the rule of thumb in a residential contract, and even in a commercial contract to some extent, was 10% deposit. Question?
So, I know that rule. This is a question I have for you since you're an attorney. Every case I've ever went in front of a judge and negotiated a contract, they always point that out. Why is it less than 10%? Why is that?
An agreement.
I mean, they always point out, like,
Who
every
points
time,
out? The judge?
the judge would be like, how come the deposit's less than 10%? They always question that in every...
Because it's a good question.
It's a valid question.
It's a valid
It's
question.
just a
It's
consideration.
negotiation. It's purely business negotiation. The absolute lawyer cop-out There's like 3 or 4 real good lawyer cop-outs. Number one, it's a business decision. That means I can tell you guys what the law is, I can tell you what the custom is, but ultimately, the buyer and seller are going to agree on the business terms of the contract. I can advise, but it's a business decision. So it's an absolute cop-out. Other 2 cop-outs are, it's an insurance requirement, and the lender requires it. So those are the ones that get you out of giving a legal answer. Okay?
How about what you can, how does it's illegal?
It's not. There's the 10% is a rule of thumb.
What were the last 2 though?
Oh, the cop-outs?
Yeah.
The insurance company requires it.
But how would that be a justification for a lower escrow?
Oh, it's not. It's justification for other cop-outs, other answers. Why we're requiring you to have in the lease something, whatever it is. No, not the 10%. That's a lender's requirement.
Deductible or something.
That actually you can get away with the lender's requirement if you're doing like new condos or new properties, new construction, and the lenders will actually put in their, especially if it's pre-construction, they will actually put a provision in the loan documents that will require, and 10% is not the rule there anymore because of what's happened back in the last time the condo market crashed. They will put in the loan documents that a bona fide contract for purpose of meeting the pre-sale requirement, which means that you have to sell X% of the units in the project before you're going to get $1 on a construction loan. And they will say a bona fide contract is not a relative or affiliate of the developer. You'd be surprised how many times that happens. And sometimes that's legitimate though. And it has to have a deposit of at least 10, 20, as much as 30% sometimes. And the reason for that is, back in 2009, 2010, people put 20% up on the condos. And this is more in Dade County than here, but it was all over the place. So you put up a 20% deposit to buy this beautiful condo for $700,000 along Biscayne Boulevard. And the market crashes. And the values of the units drop 30%. Well, you got your quantitative course this morning. You know if you're a business person, or you've got any kind of smarts when it comes to investing, it's cheaper to walk away from a 20% loss than a 30% loss. Unless you're going to buy it and hold it and hope that it's going to come back. But typically what was happening was people were walking away from huge amounts of deposits, the 10%, 50%, 20% deposits. The builder's sitting there going, I built this building because I have these contracts. Now no one's closing. I can't pay off my construction loan with a bag of 20% deposits. I'm screwed. And so that's what happened. So now, come forward a little bit in time, and what was really going on with the deposits was you were seeing situations where not only was the upfront deposit greater, but as soon as that builder broke ground, they had to come up to 40%. And as soon as they went up started to go vertical on the foundation or put the roof on the building, or the top floor, they had to go to 60%. To the point where, especially in a cash contract, by the time you got to closing, 60, 70, 80% of the money was already in escrow. So that the builder didn't have that risk. And you know what? The buyers are doing it. And as a result, the construction loads are smaller because under the condo statute, the builder's allowed to use anything beyond 10% for construction purposes.
But that's why a lot of builders, they will sell before they develop all their units, especially on something like that if it's a hot property.
That's pre-construction I'm talking about.
Yeah, pre-construction, and then like what was happening back in 2009, 2007, when a neighborhood or a unit would go up like that, or a high rise, everybody would quickly, when I was coming up in the street business, all the realtors did, if you had a hot one, you would quickly put in your deposit located. As soon as they break ground, it's a resale, it's an easy flip.
Except many developer contracts prohibit that.
Nowadays they do.
Even then.
But then they were doing it a lot in the Palm Beach County area. That was
it probably was a violation of the contract. Because let's face it, if you're the developer and the value goes up, you want the increase. You don't want to give it to the next guy, you want to make it close.
But I see a lot of neighborhoods, even now with the higher end neighborhoods, they still do that. A lot of investors will come in and buy 3-4 units, let them finish developing right when they develop, put it right back on the market and sell it.
But usually they close on it.
Yeah, they close on it.
Oh, that's different.
Yeah.
That's different.
We're always closing. We're not closing.
Oh,
We're not
flipping, because that's not flipping.
No, I mean like closing, but you close it, but you never live in it, and you're gonna sell it.
That's different.
Yeah.
That's just making an investment, buying it before it's built, waiting for it to be built, because, think about it, if you need to move to an area and you want to buy a condo, because you're going to move there, you're going to live there, and you come and you see that this one's going to be ready in 2 years, and this one you can move into right now, this has more value to you if you have to move into the area. If you have to wait the 2 years, then, so the person that's done that is entitled to make a profit for investing up front. Then, yeah, that's different.
I'm just saying a lot of developers I would know would go to those kind of investors first and say, here, pay me for the cash. When I'm done developing, you can sell for whatever.
So,
What I'm saying is that a lot of high rises were being done that way in the past. Where
okay, but, so, where the lenders have put a kibosh on that, where it's been restricted to prevent another crash, is the lenders are requiring that the buyers be limited to a certain percentage of investors, and the rest to be owner occupied and have to be bona fide owner occupied with, commitments for a residential mortgage or proof of funds. See, we talked about downturn stuff, and this is downturn stuff. So if you don't, that's where it's really not a cop-out to say it's a lender requirement, because it really is a lender requirement. They want to know that that builder is going to be able to pay off the mortgage when the property is finished.
Have you had an experience where the liquidated damages are not included in the contract, and then the court has to decide what the damages
Sure.
are?
All the time. Because there's lots of contracts that aren't purchase and sale agreements. Take, for example, leases. He said, what a great segue. See, next section. Well, let me finish the other side. There's two more things I want to talk about in contract damages and contract defaults. So what we've been discussing just now, and it was a good discussion, I appreciate the questions, because like I've said before, the questions help keep the discussion relevant and moving. We're talking about the buyer's side. It's the buyer that puts up the deposit, and the buyer that has the liquidated damages. What happens when the seller chooses not to close? Why would the seller not want to close? Why would the seller get to a point where they've gotten all this work done, and they built this building, and all of a sudden they choose not to close with the buyer? They want to default under the contract.
Feel better off?
There you go. That's it. Perfect answer. Perfect answer. The market has come up. They're being taken them 2 years to build. The property is now worth $200,000 more than it was originally. So they say, they just sell it to somebody else. So as long as the deed hasn't occurred, and like they start letting the first buyer know that the close is not going to happen, what's going to happen, how can you prevent this? Well, you could sue for money damages, certainly. And you could say that you promised to sell me this property for $500,000, and now you're refusing and it's worth $700,000, and I've lost $200,000. You have to go to court, because it's not liquidated damages, but now you have to go to court and prove all of those things. It's obviously easy to prove that I have a contract at $500,000. It may be easy just because especially in a condo, because there's 3 other identical units selling for $700. So now you go to the judge and you can show that, and the judge says, okay, you screwed him, he lost $200,000, damages $200,000. That's easy. But in some cases, go ahead.
Is that it's a suit for cancellation or rescission, or is that different?
No, this is a default.
Okay, sorry.
So that's fine if you have boxes in the sky. But if you're buying the waterfront house with the 100-foot dock, and there's only one on this island with no fixed bridges to the ocean, and you really want this house, and the seller's decided that someone else, the guy with the 103-foot yacht wants it because he's got more money, now what happens? I signed a contract to buy this from you for $3 million just because he's giving you $3.5 million. That's not right. We had an agreement. So now I file a lawsuit for specific performance. Specific performance is a lawsuit against the seller to make the seller, it could be any party to a contract, but in real estate contracts, it's usually only against the seller to make the seller do what he agreed to do. The words are, unlike a lot of terms in law, these words are pretty clear. To make him specifically perform what he agreed to perform. He agreed to sell you the house for $3 million, sell the house for $3 million. Now the buyer has to show that he can do it before he, you know, to the judge. And I have been involved in sophisticated development contracts where we went back and forth for weeks on this, just on the specific performance. Because when you file for specific performance, you file what's called a notice of lis pendens. We talked about that. It's an action. It's a piece of paper that gets put into the public records, not unlike the notice of interest, that blocks the title, so that they can't sell it out from under you while the case is being heard. And that screws up the owner from being able to sell it to somebody else. So, in commercial transaction, where it's a hot topic, we went back and forth because what the seller said was, as a prerequisite to the specific performance action, we want that buyer to prove that he has the ability to close. So if we lose this, if he pulls us through the courts for 6 months, and the judge rules against us, he can't go, oh, sorry, I don't have the money. Okay, and I just felt like making you crazy for 6 months because of what you did to me. Go sell it whoever you want, I don't have the money. Now the developer's lost, you know. So, it's a really long, it's unusual, but it happens. It's a way to prevent abuses. Because people play all kinds of games, they stretch you out, because what they're trying to do in these kinds of disputes is they're trying to weaken the parties. They're trying to make it so that, oh my God, I'll give a little bit. Just give me $2.8 million instead of $3 million, just close. Get out of my head. And that's actually what goes on. You know, you go into court and you start fighting, and believe me, it's a long, slow, expensive process. And no one is ever happy. Even when you win, you're unhappy. Because, yeah, you might get your result, but you've been tied up. You have to go to hearings. You have to go to depositions. You have to pay money for discovery. And it's just long, and emotions, and it's endless. And it occupies, you know, the guy's got a business to run, whether he's a developer or whatever else he's doing, it's occupying your head. So they'll make a deal to give up for this whole thing to go away. And that's called settlement. This is settled all the time. The converse to specific performance, if you will, is injunctive relief. Not so much in a real estate contract, but let's take an employment agreement, or a sale of a business, or something like that where you have a non-competition agreement. And I am an expert in manufacturing widgets. I make the best widgets in town. And I've done so well with my widget business that I'm going to sell you my widget business for a lot of money. You want to get the widget business. And you want to take my business that I've built, you're going to pay me a fortune so I can go and retire and buy the yacht and the 100-foot dock to keep it. And you're going to take over and you're going to make your life's fortune in the widget business. But you don't want me to sell you the business and go down the street and open up a competing company. So I signed a non-competition agreement. Very detailed non-competition agreement that says I can't be in the widget business either as a principal or as an employee or as a hidden owner or anything. I can't be in the widget business. You pay me my $27 million in the widget company and you go to work. Then you find out that I have a little office down the street, just a little office, in somebody else's company. And I'm quietly whispering in his ear how to make widgets, how to make it a certain way. And that person is taking my quiet advice, and you find out about this. What are you going to do? So you go to court, and you get the court to order me to stop violating the covenant. That's called an injunction. I'm being enjoined from breaking my contract. And it's a special kind of relief, and it's only available, it's called equitable relief, and it's only available when money damages won't do. Because there's no amount of money that's going to make it so that I can hurt your business, that I sold you with this representation of covenant. The only way to fix it is for the court to say, no, you can't do this anymore. Injunctive relief. Okay, away from contracts, let's talk about leases. So, as with most contracts, the things we're talking about, there's stuff that tenants have to do. And for the most part, when you see a default in a lease, it's a tenant default, not a landlord default. It's possible to have a landlord default, but it's much more rare. And what do you think is the number one default committed by a tenant? Here we go, see, easy, right there. So, they stop paying rent. Well, that's a bad idea. The landlord doesn't like that. So what can the landlord get? And I'm not going to put it up on the screen because you have it in the materials from when I went through the leases, but there's a whole section on defaults and remedies in the leases, and it gives you the wording, but let me give you the concepts. So now it comes January 1st, and I don't pay the rent. And the landlord calls me up and says, hey, check didn't come in. Let me check with my bookkeeper, I'm really sorry. A couple weeks goes by, no check. Landlord says, calls him up again and says, hey, you know, that check never showed up. Oh, I am so sorry. I was on vacation. You know, December was really rough. I took a week off. I was in California visiting my family. I'll get to it. I'm back. I'll have it taken care of. You'll have it by the end of the week. End of the week comes. Anyone want to take a guess?
It goes.
No rent. Now it's February 1st. Now the landlord's getting a little concerned because not only is the January check not there, the February check is not there. Now the landlord says, I got to do something about this. So a couple of different things can happen. First thing that's going to happen probably is the landlord's going to send an email, or it used to be a letter, but now it's supposed to be an email to the tenant. Dear tenant, it's February 3rd. The groundhog did not see his shadow, and I didn't see your rent check. So you owe me for January and February. Please send me the check right away. A couple of minutes goes by, no answer to the email. They've had a good relationship, it's a little unusual, but now there's no answer to the email. Now the landlord's getting nervous. Who does the landlord call next? Me. David, you have a problem. Okay, so now I look at the lease, and I see, always look at the contract for notice provisions. Even if you're doing it yourself and it's your property and all, you always want to see what's been agreed upon, and you want to stick to it exactly. And if it doesn't say email, don't send it by email. If it says certified mail, send it by certified mail. If it doesn't say anything, double check a statute and make sure it's not required by statute how to send it. And you send the default letter and you say, you have failed to pay the rent for the months of blah, blah, the amount of this. Remember the 3-day notice? That was for an eviction. Here we're not looking for an eviction right away. We're trying to get the money. So we're making the demand for the money in accordance with the terms of the lease, but we're not terminating possession. The reason we're not terminating possession could be it's a very specialized facility. We know they've got the money. We don't want to have to go building it out. They've been a good tenant up until last month. Something's not right. They're just not paying. You make the demand. Okay. Nothing works. It all goes south. Maybe they move out. Let's say they move out. Let's say they just pack up in the night. You go in there Monday morning and the place is empty. Or the lights are off and it's dark. Now you have a problem. Now it could be March already. Now there's 3 months past due. And there's another 3 years left on the lease. So what do? We go to court. And we file an action for damages. That's what we're talking about here, is damages. Now what can you get? Depending upon the wording of the lease, and they all vary, you're certainly entitled to get past due rent, as well as any late charges that are in the lease. And what is rent? Well, rent can be base rent. Remember we talked about the different elements of rent. There's base rent, which is the regular monthly payment. There's expenses, which are also defined as rent. The real estate taxes, the insurance, the common area maintenance, the late charges. So all those things are rent, so you can claim all of those things. Many leases, not all, but many leases have an acceleration provision, which says that in the event of a default like this, the landlord is entitled to recover all of the rent for the rest of the term of the lease. Because that's what the tenant agreed to pay. That's the contract. If the landlord re-rents the place because it's been vacated, then the tenant is entitled to credit for whatever the landlord receives minus the landlord's costs. Some leases that are long and complicated, it depends on the market, will spell all this out. They will say all the things that the landlord is entitled to recover from the rent flow that's coming from a substituted tenant. The landlord's reletting of the property to reduce his damages is called mitigation. See it up there in the outline, mitigation. In some states, the landlord is obligated to mitigate its damages. To mitigate means to reduce your damages. In Florida, a commercial landlord has no legal obligation to mitigate damages. I want to make that really clear. They have no legal obligation to mitigate damages. What a landlord is allowed to do in Florida, commercial, is they're allowed to sit back and do absolutely nothing and just collect the rent from the tenant as the rent becomes due. They can just sit back and wait and demand it and collect it. They can also accelerate it. When they accelerate it, however, which means they're entitled to their three years of rent, if it's not in the lease, the courts almost always will discount it by its present value because, as you all know from your quantitative classes, there's a time value to money. So the court says, well, if we're going to give you 3 years of rent now, we're going to discount it because you're getting it now and you're not getting a stream over the next 3 years. If there's a percentage rent clause, some leases will say that the amount of rent to claim for a default, whether by acceleration or by standing by and collecting it as it comes due, would be the amount of percentage rent that was payable the last month of the lease before they were evicted, or the average of the last 12 months, or there's all kinds of ways to define it. But since the business deal between the landlord and tenant was to include the base rent plus a percentage rent factor, that gets included in the damages as well. And the last type of rent damage, which we touched on briefly, is holdover rent. And holdover rent, by statute, can be double, or by contract, the parties have agreed to a lesser amount. What I've often done for the benefit of the tenant, because what sometimes will happen will be the replacement property, the replacement premises that the tenant is going to move to isn't ready. And because it isn't ready, they can't move. Either they're operating a professional office, they're operating a manufacturing facility, a retail store, and they don't want to be out of business. So they're going to stay put for an extra month or two until they can move to the new space. So what I'll do is, since the landlord is being damaged and it is a violation of the contract, I'll provide for a holdover rent of 125% for 2 months, then 150% for 3 months, 4 months, and then 200%. Because you don't want the tenant to just stay forever, because the landlord may have other damages. The landlord may have leased the space and has another tenant waiting to come in who can't. So that's all a negotiation. In addition to money, and we've talked about this a little bit in the leases, and a lot in the last week at the end of the real estate litigation, in addition to money, the other thing that the landlord wants to recover from the tenant, if the tenant goes into default, is possession. The tenant is sitting there in the landlord's space. So they want to have the space back so they can, first of all, they don't want the tenant in there rent-free, because the tenant is doing business, the tenant is making money being in the space. The landlord definitely does not want that. The tenant should be removed. So there's different ways to recover possession. One is a complete recapture. This is where the landlord, this would typically only happen in a upswing type market, where the landlord says, okay, tenant, I know you're not making it, you owe me 3 months rent, I'm just going to end the lease. Get out, give me my keys, I'm not going to chase you, I'm not going to go after the rent in the future, I'm recapturing the space. This is a complete termination of the lease of the tenant's obligation. It's a little unusual, except if the landlord knows tenant's got no money. So it doesn't do him any good to go chase him in court, and there's no personal guarantee, which happens with a lot of smaller tenants, and they just want to be done with it. Sometimes there will be a negotiation. I just did one recently where the tenant is performing. The tenant is not in default, but the tenant is closing their operations. The tenant has come to the landlord and says, look, I know I have 3 years left or 2 years left. I will pay you something if you let me out of the lease. And the landlord said, then they came up with a dollar amount, a couple $100,000, and that's enough to make up for the lost rent while the landlord re-rents it. The other thing that the landlord said to the tenant, because of the nature of the business, is if you want, I will allow you to leave all of your equipment. And just because they're closing up a bunch of stores, and rather than have to go to the expense of removing it, you can leave it and I'll take care of it. Sounds like a nice favor, doesn't it? In reality, what happens is the landlord then has a fully operational blank. I don't know if Phil's blank could be grocery store, restaurant, whatever it is. But it's all the stuff is there because, especially with a restaurant, or I don't know what else, what other kind of equipment.
Salon.
Salon's another good example. Thank you. The used equipment, and I don't know if this is true for salon equipment, but let's assume that it is for this discussion. Used restaurant equipment particularly is worth a fraction of what it's worth new. You can't go and sell used sinks and stoves and tables and there's no value to it. However, if the landlord can offer a small restaurant operator a turnkey operation where all he has to do is change the signs and change the menu, that's got huge value, tremendous value to a landlord. So, and that happens all the time, especially with restaurants. My example happens to be a small grocery store chain that's pulling out. And if they leave the equipment, fine. If they don't leave the equipment, he'll gut it and just rent it for some other use. If the equipment's there, he can find another small chain to come in. As long as they take the food out, leave the refrigeration equipment, leave the shelves, right?
Yeah, it's so expensive to set up that stuff.
It is very expensive to set it up, but to take it down, you don't get back but a fraction.
Yeah.
Now, in a lot of cases, especially when you have a tenant that doesn't have a lot of money, the business deal between the landlord and tenant will be, I'll let you out of the lease if you leave the equipment in good working order. In the case, in my example, there's a cash payment because it's a credit tenant, or sort of.
And then also, it's a lot of commercial leases too for tenants, they pay for build out.
Who pays for the build out?
The landlord, you'll pay for
Right.
it. So
Well,
you pay for build out. So if you can save your money on build out, because like a lot of new like people that purchase shopping centers like strip malls, when they first got to turn them around, that's the incentive to get them in there is to say we'll offer you build out in a couple months free. So if your build out, if the build out for that client's gonna be 50 grand, and there's a unit there that can save you that 50 grand build out. You know what I mean?
That's an incentive, and plus, well, typically build out is worked into the rent somehow.
Yeah.
So anyway, yes, a built out space for the right user is worth more than empty space. But the real point of what I'm saying is not so much from that side, but from the other side, where the value of getting rid of the equipment is minimal compared to the value of purchasing it. That's what's important there. So that's the other type of eliminating possession, evicting the tenant, is where the landlord takes possession of the premises for the tenant's account. Now they're not terminating the lease. They're not releasing the tenant from its obligation. But in this case, they're saying, okay, you haven't paid your rent, we're terminating possession, get out. I'm taking over the space, and I'm going to try and re-rent the space. I'm the landlord. I'm going to try and re-rent the space. And whatever I get for it, minus whatever it costs me to do it, I'll give you credit for it. And if I get less than what's under your lease, you have to pay me the difference. So the tenant doesn't have it right, although in let me show my jumping. I'm jumping, it's okay. Although, in a real smart tenant would come to the landlord and say, hey, I'm suffering, I'm not doing well, I can't pay the rent, I want to sublease half my premises out. But we'll get to that because it's a way to handle downturns where the tenant is trying to keep control of the space and preserve their own business, as opposed to an eviction where the landlord takes possession and then rents it out for whatever they can get for it to get some cash flow, and the tenant's obligated for the difference. And again, if there's a question that you have to, a threshold question, is the tenant collectible? A lot of landlords, particularly smaller business landlords, will insist on a personal guarantee. Personal guarantee is when the human signs in addition to the entity, and that may or may not be good. It's as good as how much money is in their wallet or checking account. Because if you don't have it, then there's no good in chasing the guarantee. But having that personal guarantee keeps that tenant paying attention to what's going on because he doesn't want to get sued personally. And it's almost more psychological than financial. Something to watch out for that I see in the tenants will try to throw into certain leases, and that is when the landlord computes the amount of the damages and says how much credit the tenant is going to get back. You'll see a tenant try and say that the landlord is entitled to the fair market value of the rent for the premises. Well, that's great, but if there's nobody in there paying that rent, that tenant shouldn't get any credit for it. So I will strike that every opportunity I see it. So and it usually comes from a national tenant saying, we want credit against our ultimate deficiency obligation for what your fair market value is. It's got to be received. It's got to be. It's no good. You know, you can't go to Publix with fair market value in your hand. You can only go with rent money. Okay. Any questions about this process, the things going bad, the defaults, the remedies?
I have a question. As far as when they default, for example, if somebody says, hey, I can't pay the rent anymore, my business is closing down, I'm going to move it out at the end of this month. If you were to get that space leased and they moved out simultaneously, but the price per square foot was lower for the new tenant as opposed to the one that moved out, and then that difference, as you just mentioned,
It's deficiency.
is the deficiency, and then you take that out of the security deposit, which the tenant that moved out had as damages.
That would be great if the security deposit was big enough. It would never be big enough. It's usually a month's rent.
Okay,
So
well, in
let's
this
say-
case, we have 4 months rent. We get 4 months rent.
And how much is left on the lease?
3 years was left on the lease.
Okay,
but if you do the calculation from, like, let's say $14 a square foot to what we leased it for, which was $12.80.
Oh,
It
okay.
came out to like,
The security deposit
it came out
covered
to
it?
like $14,000, but then they had a security deposit of $17,000. So we were gonna,
That's perfect for the landlord.
yeah, so if
That's
you're-
perfect for everybody, actually.
it is, but in this case, if the tenant doesn't really understand it, and they say, no, since you got a new tenant in there, it wasn't my fault that the price per square foot was lower than what we paid for, they
Well, so
think
your fault.
we should-
You agreed to pay 14 and you moved out. It is your fault.
Yeah,
It's
so,
100% your
so in
fault.
that case, if we were to give them the $3,000 back, my question is, something in writing as like a release? Is that
So,
something that
okay.
you usually do?
Yes, absolutely.
Instead
because-
of us just giving them the $3,000, we should say, here's the $3,000, but sign this release that says you're not gonna go after the rest of the security.
And it's actually, the release goes both ways because under the terms of the lease, the landlord has the right to a deficiency, that we just talked about, the difference between what the landlord has rented the space for to the new tenant and what the old tenant was obligated to pay under the lease. Okay? Now, you have a situation where you've reached an agreement. And the tenant wants out of the sandwich and you want to be rid of this tenant forever. So very often we will do a termination agreement, very often, at the end of it. And sometimes the termination agreement says, in my example earlier, tenant's going to pay landlord $200,000 and they're off the hook for the next 3 years. And you know, in that case, maybe it's $30,000 a month of rent, so it works out. Sometimes it's landlord will let the tenant off the hook and the tenant will give the landlord all the equipment, all the furniture, fixtures, and equipment that are in the space, chairs, tables, knives, forks, stoves, sinks, everything, okay? In exchange for the landlord releasing the tenant from further obligation for their liability. In your situation, and often, by the way, above that paragraph is a security deposit, which gets released to the landlord. Now, it's unusual that you have 4 months worth. That's a good, that was a good business deal, and maybe that was made because the tenant wasn't creditworthy when the lease was signed. That happens. Sometimes instead of a personal guarantee, the tenant will put up extra cash. Makes the landlord feel better.
So if they already defaulted, they already moved out of the space, the new tenant is already in there, and then, you know, a few weeks later, you come to the deal where we would, in this case, give $3,000 back. Would that
Why
be
$3,000?
That's just a number I'm pulling out of the hat that,
Okay.
that it came out to, because we would keep the rest of the security deposit
For the deficiency.
damages,
Right.
but we would give them the $3,000 back on the security. Would it be a termination?
Yep.
It would be a
Sure.
termination, even though they already defaulted and somebody else has already.
They've stopped
Somebody else has
paying
already
rent.
signed the lease.
That doesn't matter. I mean, you have to end the contract. You never want to leave a contract hanging out there.
Yes.
If you come to an end point, whether it's a purchase and sale agreement or a lease or anything else, if you've come to an end point and now you've decided to end it by agreement, sign it. It's a one-pager. You should definitely document things like that.
And would the termination be dated as to the day that they moved out or the day that they signed it?
Doesn't matter. Well, it doesn't matter. It's signed as of the date it's signed, but it could be effective as of the date they moved out. Typically you want an agreement to reflect reality. That's all. That's not difficult to do.
Yeah, in this case, what I was worried about was that, like I said, at first they thought that they were going to get their whole security deposit back, and then when I explained to them the difference in the new rent, and that they would only get 3 out of the $17,000 back, they were very bitter about it. They just didn't understand. They didn't understand.
You should tell them that you're bitter that they defaulted.
Yeah, no, I know. There's a lot of back and forth, but I don't want to give them that $3,000 without them doing some sort of release or termination.
What people are reluctant to do, with good reason, is people are reluctant to negotiate default clauses. Because I have a very simple answer to a tenant that wants to get too heavy into negotiating with default clauses. You have complete control over this tenant. Pay the rent. Don't default. And you never have to deal with this clause. Don't come to me and start telling me, no, I'll be reasonable. You want 5 days notice instead of 3 days notice? Fine. But don't try and soften the default provisions because you're the one that's going to be bad that's going to cause these provisions to come into play. Don't come and whine to me if you defaulted and moved out that you're not getting your money back. You damaged me. I had to go, and how about, I mean, I don't know your situation specifically, but to get that replacement tenant in there, you might have to give 3 months of free rent. You might have to pay a broker's commission. There's all kinds of expenses that a landlord incurs. Why don't you do some more improvements? Replace the carpet, paint the walls, whatever it is, depending on the nature of what it is. So that landlord is damaged beyond the deficiency of the rent. They signed an agreement. They said you can have my space, because if the market rent went up dramatically, that landlord couldn't tell the tenant to leave because you get more money. Landlord doesn't have that right. So why reward the tenant in any way, shape, or form? Because I will tell you, a lot of default provisions will say that security deposits could be liquidated damages. Again, your 4 months is a lot, so you're going to have special clauses for that. 3, it's normally a month, sometimes it's 2. But again, if you have a tenant that doesn't have good credit, and there's nobody signing a personal guarantee because that's what you've negotiated, in that circumstance, then you're going to get more of a security deposit. Okay?
In the case that you mentioned, Professor, where somebody wants to negotiate those damages, would you be even skeptical of getting into business if somebody was trying to negotiate that hard?
Yeah, a little bit, yes. Yes. But you know, that's where document negotiation, where business negotiation requires finesse. Because you have to explain why you're asking for something. So if I come to you and I tell you that I don't want that acceleration provision in there, which is not a typical statutory remedy or a case remedy, that acceleration, and you say I don't want this. Why? Well, no, because I'm not going to. If I'm not going to be there, I'm not going to pay you in the future. But you're agreeing to be there for 5 years. Why wouldn't you agree to pay me my rent? Well, I'll pay you the rent as it's due. Not up front. You can't have the rent up front for 3 years if something happens. And it's always if something happens. I'm not going to default deliberately. I'm a good tenant. I'm a good businessman. I'm not going to do that. But something happens. What happens? My bookstore wasn't doing so well. Why not? Because everybody's getting on the internet. You see the publisher of the Miami Herald just filed for bankruptcy? You know why? People, how many of you get a newspaper at home every day? 0? That's great, okay. That's a good statistical story. So I can promise you 20 years ago, you do?
I get a newspaper online.
That was not the question. So we've had a terrible problem getting our newspaper delivered on time. They finally fixed it. And what would happen would be, you get this lovely customer service email apologizing for the delayed delivery and promising that they were escalating it to the contractor and blah, 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 great words. And then it says, for your convenience, click here and you can read the newspaper online. And this made me crazy. Why? Because the person that was sending me this email, and everybody they work with and work for, works for the circulation department. And if there's no newspaper being delivered, they don't have a job, any of them. So they're basically telling me in their email to put them out of a job by reading it online. And the more they screw up, and the more that we are forced to read it online, the more we think about, why am I paying so much money to have the paper in my hand, just because I've been getting it that way my whole life and I like it? Why am I paying all this money when I can pay a fraction of that and click a mouse or open an iPad and read it right like that? And all of a sudden, and I said this to people, I've said it to them on the phone. I said, do you realize you're talking yourself out of a job? Question?
But you know why newspapers will still sell? Because it's not the same experience. I got it online, and if I had it come into my office at home, I would look at it more during the week if I had the physical paper. Then I only have it online if I really want to research something.
Yeah, all the damn ads.
And all the ads, it's hard to find what you're looking for. When I know, if I'm looking for something in the classifieds, or I know to go open it up, go to the page and find it, because that's how I was taught. But online, it's a curve. It's really a curve.
I have a much more practical answer for you. Do you know how expensive it is to swat a fly with an iPad?
Oh, okay.
Smash. Okay, with that, let's take a break for a little bit. Bathroom, water, whatever, and then we will get into what goes on in corporations. Somebody want to hit that off button for the break and we'll turn it back on?